Romans 8:28 is one of the best known verses in the Bible. As we learned it from the King James, all things work together for good to those who love God. And for people who are in pain, it can be a tremendously encouraging verse. And yet to others who are in pain, it can be a tremendously discouraging verse. How on earth can the pain I'm experiencing be called good? Well, it really gets down to a translational issue. Does Paul say that all things work together for good, or does Paul say God works all things together for good? It's a significant difference, isn't it? Well, let's take a look at the passage. You look at the Greek and you can say the King James is a perfectly legitimate translation. We know that to those who love God, all things work together for good, to those who are called according to his purpose. So it's a perfectly legitimate translation. You'll notice that they took this phrase, to those who love God, and they put it near the end of the verse, so it's close to those who are called according to his purpose, and sometimes that happens. And yet there's a couple of problems with this translation. One, it gives the impression that there's some magical force in this universe that makes everything good, and that's just not the case. Physical, emotional, sexual abuse is not good. The death of a child is not inherently good, and there's not some, like I say, a magical force that makes all things work together for good. And I'm afraid that's what the King James translation and those that follow it give the impression of. The other way to view this is that panta, yes, it could be nominative, all things work together, or it could be accusative. He works all things for good. And if panta is accusative, then theon is not only the direct object of akaposin, it's also the implied subject of sunerge. To those who love God, he works all things for good. In this case, panta is an accusative of respect. There actually is a variant in the Greek where it puts hatheos right here. So God works all things. And that explains some of the footnotes. So for example, in the ESV, it says, some manuscripts, God works all things together for good, or God works in all things for good. But you don't have to go to the Greek variant to come up with this translation. God works in all things for the good. It's a perfectly legitimate translation with panta as an accusative of respect. But this also explains the reading of the NIV and the NLT in the actual text. We know that in all things, God works for the good of those who love him. NLT, we know that God causes everything to work together for the good of those who love God. And certainly this has to be the actual meaning of the text. Now, a couple of qualifications. I had lunch with a friend the other day who had been an alcoholic for 35 years, been sober for 8 years. And you look at those 35 years, you say, how can they possibly be called good? Well, God was at work in all situations for his good. Why? Well, he finally got a DUI. He went to Alcoholics Anonymous, and he's been sober for 8 years. And that drove him not only to his wife, but also to Christ. So you can look at those 35 years and say, there's no way that's good. Well, theologically, in the long term, they were. So you have to be a little careful about looking short term at something and saying, well, that's not good. That's just not good. The other thing I wanted to point out is the loss of emphasis when you swap the order of the phrases around. You go to the NIV, it says, we know that in all things, God works for the good of those who love him. And so they've taken the tois agaposin ton theon, and they've put it after the agathon because it then connects more naturally with those who are called according to his purpose. It's a common thing that is done. But the problem is that you lose the emphasis of the order of the words. And Paul is wanting to emphasize up front, this is not a promise for the world. This is a promise only for those who love him, who have been called according to his purpose. So it's to those who love God, he works all things for good. But I think the real question of this passage is, how do you define agathon? How do you define good? Well, naturally, we want to define agathon as the absence of pain and the presence of pleasure, right? That's a heresy of the wealth and prosperity gospel, as it's fleecing God's flock, trying to say that's what good is, but that is not what good is. And this is one of those cases where it's really unfortunate that we separate verse 28 from 29. And in looking at the Greek text, it's really unfortunate they put a period there, because there's no period there. What's only implied there is a comma, because you start then with a dependent clause. So what is good? The good is that there are those that God foreknew, and one of the decisions that he made in his predestination of them was so they would be conformed to the image of his Son. And the purpose of that is so that Jesus, the He, would be the firstborn among many brothers. So the good, as far as God is concerned, is that we be conformed to the image of his Son. And whether we like it or not, and whether we want to admit it or not, pain is the best teacher there is. And it is pain that is used to teach my alcoholic friend and all of us what it is to look like Jesus. The real joy of the Christian life comes from the fact that we have a sovereign God who is in control of all things, and he loves his children so much that he wants his good for us, and his good is that we look like Jesus. And so he works in the midst of all situations for his good for us, and his good for us should be ultimately our own good.